Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. I am extremely happy to be back for a public episode of yet another joint Kraken, or even if you would like to call it a scientific analysis or deep dive into the global stories in addition to the science of what has been occurring all over the world. Now, for those of you that have said, Dave, where have you been? It seems like there's some things that seem a little bit, I guess you could say, suspicious. You're not as active as you once were with respects to the public side of the show. Even I will say that in the coming weeks and in the very short amount of coming weeks. All of you folks will see and understand why that is the case, I can assure you. Now, with that said, we are joined here by our great friend and partner of the show, Riel. Riel, how you doing today? And if you'd like to share your screen to take it away, I will start with the first story.
I'm doing fantastic, Dave. Super honored, as always, to be here with you. Super excited for this report. I know that everybody's happy to see you as well. And yeah, let's get to it. So, you've got the first story today. And just for the record, it's going to be mostly geopolitical and catching up on the world news. We're not focusing too much on the science of what's going on, but we definitely still have enough because it's been about just over a week since we last did an episode. So, Dave, first story's for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So, first and foremost, according to Vice.com, the Navy says that all UFO videos that are classified and releasing them, quote, will harm national security, end quote. To a large degree, I would say, I would, to be honest with you folks, I would understand this with respects to if one delves into the scientific aspect of this topic, one may find that there are some legitimate concerns with respects to this type of technology. And what I mean by that is anti-gravitic, if you will. Many of you folks will see in the coming weeks as well why that is the case. Now, with that said, I don't think that is a end all be all blanket statement with respects to not releasing any of them. I think that if metadata is wiped, and I think that if there are certain videos that inhabit far more intricate detail within them, I think in fact they could be released. Now, with that said, I'm not on the inside of the Navy. I don't mean to speak on behalf of the Navy whatsoever, but we see here, and I quote, the Black Vault was seeking all videos, quote, with the designation of unidentified aerial phenomena, end quote. This is an interesting response from the Navy because often military agencies will issue a so-called GLOMAR response where they neither confirm nor deny that the records exist and refuse to say anything more. In this response, the Navy is admitting that it has more videos and also gives a rationale for releasing 3 previous UFO videos. So again, end quote. Again, we see, for example, that I'm going to cut through I'm going to separate the wheat from the chaff of my personal perspective. I could be wrong, but I'll break it down for you very simply, folks. I think what's occurring behind the scenes is I guess you could say a strategic dogfight, if you will, between different factions of various agencies. The Navy being one of them, amongst others. And I think what we're seeing here is a push to not have so much disclosed, because if it is, then it would have people questioning, and God forbid that happens with respects to the overall apparatus in which we're living in. So again, it's quite political. I don't mean to use that as a justification to cover all of this up. I think that there is still quite a bit that can be released at this very moment that would certainly, unfortunately though, for the ones that want this covered up, and I say unfortunately with air quotes and sarcastically, releasing any more will only bring more inquisitiveness and even curiosity from those that are not interested in this subject. So that's where I stand on that, and I'll leave it there.
Right on. They, yeah, deliberately started with this article because, we got to go back to the fundamentals of the channel with the UFO secrecy and cover up. And I just wanted to add on that this was kind of a main concern from the congressional hearings. This was what we kind of were worried about, but we're glad that they're not going immediately for the citizen journalists that are trying to talk about this. They're just saying that they're going to maintain the secrecy. It's like, okay, fair enough. That's what we expected. So on to the next one. From Al Jazeera, the United Nations says 50 million people worldwide are stuck in modern slavery. Between the pandemic, armed conflicts, and climate change, they have exacerbated conditions, trapping people in forced labor or marriage. Yeah, this is pretty devastating when you think about that. 50 million people. I do wonder if it's even more than that. But of course, the emphasis for me is the situation being exacerbated by the pandemic, which worsened conditioned and swelled debt levels for many workers. Also, I want to point out that the UN had a goal to eradicate all forms of modern slavery by 2030, but the number of people caught up in forced labor or forced marriage ballooned by 10 million between 2016 and 2021. So just pointing out that it's like they're using the slavery number goal with their agenda, obviously Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So I just wonder the connections there. And I think we're learning more and more that the pandemic, the response of the pandemic has only made things worse and was not the right thing. And I'm very curious to see if people end up admitting it. But Dave, anything you want to add here?
Actually, to tell you the truth, I was going to say the exact same thing as you were, so I'll just leave that right there.
Right
Um,
on.
the
Take.
next thing is that according to Catholic World Report, Pope Francis has instructed the Vatican entities to move all funds to the Vatican Bank by September 30th. What's interesting about this is there have been some people, and I will come out and say it from a spiritual or energetic perspective, regardless of what, a train of thought or line of you could say energetic pursuit one follows. A lot of people have been talking about certain dates within the month of November being something that may in fact be some type of energetic shift, if you will, of this type of sort. And I don't mean to be overly vague, but it's quite interesting when you see a lot of the major institutions of the world, institutions that have been alleged, I want to say that here, alleged to have cooperated in the cover-up of a lot of different, I guess you could say, incredible benevolent discoveries are the ones responding to this in kind. Now, I'm not trying to say there is a direct correlation there, but I think it is something that we can speculate on and safely say, well, okay, again, is there something going on within a particular scientific state, if you will, that has created a chain of events to occur globally, whether it's with the UN, the WEF, the Vatican, and so that's where my mind goes with this in particular. But that's where I'll leave it myself. How about you, Rio?
Absolutely. And this seems to be compounding from the previous reports that we've seen that the Vatican has properties all over the world and they're valued at much higher than have ever been reported because it was never public before. And this goes in line with the Pope apologizing to the Indigenous people of Canada for the atrocities and abuses. And well, here's the bank, here's all the money. Maybe this is going to be part of the reparations. So we're seeing their publicly funded stuff, and then maybe soon it's going to go to part of the apology. But anyway, yeah, greatly said, Dave. And on to the next one. This is a brief one. The Queen in Canada, 22 visits during her reign. As we know, she passed away very recently, but I just wanted to do this article because of the significance of 22 visits during her reign. Where have we seen this number before? Well, if we looked at the principles of the fundamentals of Kabbalistic cosmogony from Secret Teachings of All Ages, there are 22 paths in the tree of life. And the 22 is a very significant number in the esoteric world. So seeing this number so blatantly in regards to the passing of the Queen and how her life was set up to have 22 official visits, to me, that's some cryptocracy at play at its finest. But I'm also going to just do this next one because I kind of lumped a few of them together. So as we know, the Queen passed, and the next one is Charles III, formally proclaimed king. Princes William and Harry appear together. So King Charles III was formally proclaimed sovereign of the United Kingdom on Saturday, as officials unveiled details of the meticulously choreographed ceremonies that will culminate in the state funeral of his mother. So when I reported on the Queen dying, at the last Kraken, it was like all these questions, what's going to happen? We're going to see. And here we have King Charles as being appointed the next leader. And just, I'm going to do this one as well. And then Dave, it'll be you after this. But here is from the New York Post talking about King Charles's infamous Black Spider memos, which will affect his leadership. I had never heard of this before, so I was very curious as to what it means for the Black Spider memos. So we'll just say King Charles, he has passionate views on everything from organic farming to climate change, education to modernist architecture, and for years the monarch has refused to keep them to himself. Ignoring protocol that requires the British royal family to remain neutral, the heir to the throne was previously dubbed the meddling prince for making his views known to elected officials in Britain. In March 2022, he publicly called the Russian invasion of Ukraine a brutal aggression. Years earlier, he referred to the head of state as comparing him to the Nazi leader Adolf Hitler when Russia annexed Crimea. But the point of this Black Spider memo is they found a series of letters that Charles had written to former British Prime Minister Tony Blair and other legislators, which were revealed in public after a decade-long legal battle. Dubbed the Black Spider Memos, a cache of 27 letters, 10 of them were handwritten by the prince, included a September 8th, 2004 missive lobbying Blair to cull badgers and ignore the badger lobby in the UK. So this whole, find it very fascinating that they call it the Black Spider Memo because of all the ominous stuff that we
Well,
relate to.
if I could say, and I'll be the one to
Please.
say it, not to sound like a salesperson here, but for those that have been on the Patreon for the past couple months, we covered some of that direct or circumstantially direct correlation to the Nazi the I guess you could say the Black Sun occult and things like this,
Yes.
as well as the potential correlations to certain star forts around the world as well.
Yes.
Again, circumstantial, anecdotal, if you will, pieces of evidence, granted, yes, but evidence nonetheless within certain contexts of situations. So it makes one think. So that's my.
As well as throwing that out there, you included the Black Spider sculptures in one of the Patreon episodes, and that was fascinating. So which we can't talk about that here, but when you go into the the deeper meanings of what that reflects, and then have this called the Black Spider Memos, it's like, okay, so yeah, what is really going on? But okay, so this is for you here.
We see here, according to ctvnews.ca, this is a Canadian story. The Rogers outage has sparked a deal in Canada between major telecoms, so telecommunication companies. So basically, I'll sum this up for everybody. There, in the past 2 years, for anyone that's a Canadian who has been with there are a handful of mobile carrier providers, as well as we could say infrastructure providers, for whether it's for cable TV, whether it's for banking, wire transfers, you name it. And it is of my humble opinion that there has been I guess you could say, under the table, I guess, conspiring to ensure that this particular company, Rogers, just so happens to win maybe not all, but a good chunk of the contracts that were attributed, whether it's with telecom or with, even for crying out loud, radio and things like this in certain cases. So ultimately, what we see is that we find this company, Rogers, and for those that are outside of Canada, was essentially monopolizing the market. They were buying up companies, and which, again, that's not for me to say one direction or the other, but what they were doing that started to tick me off was they were essentially lobbying Canadian politicians to ensure that no American telecommunication company could enter the Canadian market, therefore driving down the price. So what recently happened was a banking, we call it in Canada, e-transfer, electronic transfer system, because in Canada, we're not, at least personally, I'm not allowed to have Venmo. I can have PayPal, but not Venmo and some of the American services. What happened was Rogers went down, and also coincidentally, the same day they went down, no one can send, anyone that was using the Rogers network could not send an Interac electronic transfer, which was give or take half the country. So that started to create a lot of issues. Now, Riel, if you want to jump in if I'm missing anything, but that's as I
well, yeah, you summed that up very well. But the most recent thing with when Rogers went out, the issue was that people could not call 911 because Rogers had the deal with the Canadian government, so they had the monopoly not on just texting but emergency services. And so, as the article says, that the member from the Trudeau's government, Champagne, met up with the CEO of Rogers, and they had to say, okay, if this happens again, we have to change something. So
it's kind of like all the guys at the top get together quietly at a restaurant, and they all make agreements. It's kind of like, quote unquote, real power, dare I say, within certain contexts, not all, resides within a handful of individuals making definitive decisions that then ripple out to the rest. So
well, but yeah, but that sounds like you're talking about like fascism or something, or corporations involved in government, and that's not a thing because we live in a democracy. So you're talking crazy.
Thank you very much for correcting me, Riel. I appreciate it so much. This is
sure. Actually, we'll do this one just to keep it in line with the Canadian theme here. So Canadians are hurting, says Poilievre, who is fighting for the working class in his first caucus speech. So for folks that are outside of Canada, even in Canada, the Conservative Party of Canada just elected a new leader. His name is Pierre Poilievre. So to compare it to the American system, it's the Liberals and Conservatives compared to the Democrats and the Republicans. So Poilievre is now the face of the Conservative Party. So this is a very interesting one because he actually has been an outspoken critic of the mandates, of the restrictions. I mean, anybody can criticize Trudeau. That's not that hard. He's also criticized the WEF, and he's actually brought it up. So he's actually one of the few people that actually has been in a position to say, where is the money coming from? I remember this in Parliament. He asked, where is the money coming from that the Canadian government is using to bail everybody out, essentially? And nobody had an answer. But not to say that he's, somebody that I am supporting. It's just interesting that he actually was doing it. So, it's just interesting to see where this goes. But I do just want to chime in because I've been paying pretty close attention to this one. And Poilievre, as a Conservative leader, is more worried about losing votes to the emerging People's Party of Canada than he is to losing votes to the NDP or the Liberals. So the NDP and Liberals on the left side, but on the right side of things, people are leaving the Conservatives to go join this new right-wing party because they are fundamentally against all mandates, all passport, like all the V passports, and against WEF, IMF, the globalist stuff. So he's actually trying to go full on right wing, not in the extreme sense, but just totally about minimal government. And it's interesting to just see, like, in Canada, there's a movement of people just getting away from the Liberals and Conservatives altogether. So he's trying to bring them back into it. We'll see where it goes, but yeah, that's it. Dave, you want to say anything on that?
No, your fingers on the pulse there, and I'll leave it there. I trust you with that. The next thing is that Apple unveils its iPhone 14, according to ctvnews.ca, with satellite SOS Ultra Watch for outdoors. Apparently, this has been quite a big and significant software upgrade or jump, as I sort of sifted through the news earlier this morning prior to this recording. What's quite peculiar about all of this is we see as well that, well, it's, again, Apple has always been allegedly at the forefront, if not of technology, then definitely of branding and marketing. So again, many have said that this is the most significant jump since iOS 6 to iOS 7. But we see here, thank you, Ralph, for highlighting for those watching visually, quote, the outdoor focused products will test whether Apple's relatively affluent customer base will keep spending in the face of rising inflation. So again, we see that it becomes a bit of a complex system with respect to the overall apparatus. If you have people at the top that may or may not want to potentially or unpotentially, create damage to certain we could say economic systems on a global scale, it becomes a little bit more difficult to do that when you have the companies at the top being directly affected by it, right? Especially when those guys at the top, a lot of them may or may not be the buddies of certain politicians. If we could scroll back up very quickly, if that's all right, to the highlighted one here, quote, other companies are working on similar functions. SpaceX founder Elon Musk said last month it is working with T-Mobile to use its Starlink satellites to connect phones directly to the internet, end quote. I'll leave that there.
This is the big one for me, honestly, with the latest upgrades, like talking about it's connecting to satellite SOS. It's like clearly we know that they incrementally release the technology when they've had it stored for decades, and the next model is like, well, how can we go a little bit closer so that Elon Musk with the Starlink, your phone here, it's just this interconnectedness web of artificial consciousness connectedness, something like that.
Well, if you see, for example, that in 2010 the iPhone 4 had a gyroscope, that was a huge deal at the time. We see, for example, that if for those that are on the Patreon, the Gen Z Patreon, there's been a history of development where the gyroscope in various sizes, forms, and purposes and technicalities was, dare I say, maybe not mastered, but certainly able to have been put in a phone far prior to 2010. So again, to your point.
Awesome. Yeah. And then let's see. Okay, already did that one. Okay, here we go. So from the Jerusalem Post, rebuilding Ukraine after Russian invasion may cost 350 billion, experts say. The expert is from the World Bank Regional Country Director for Eastern Europe. He says the findings are based on a very strong internationally accepted methodology. Without even reading this article, Build Back Better. This is literally the game plan, is to destroy a country and then put in the infrastructure just like they did in Iraq and Afghanistan. You outsource the contractors, you get all these corrupt engineering firms and all that, and spend all this money, and then you build it the way that you want to have control of it. And they're probably going to make this a smart city, resilient, smart country, resilient country, something like that. And of course, the World Bank is directly involved with all of these things. And I love it that they say internationally accepted methodology. Trust the science. Just trust the internationally the consensus reality of the geopolitical experts. And that's really it. That we don't even need to go into it.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
Right on. Okay.
The next thing is that according to the New York Post, Putin faces calls to resign from Russian city officials over the Ukraine war. We see, for example, that again, as with any, and again, this is where one could argue whether loosely or strongly the correlation with respects to a human system or apparatus, whether it is an organized crime group, whether it is a government, whether it is a private business, whether it is a, dare I say, even a terrorist cell. We see, for example, that again, it is humans interacting with other humans. So the reason I say that is because if we look at this big picture, my humble opinion is one of two things, and I'm not saying this is good nor bad, but Putin is going to essentially go for those that are trying to, I guess you could say, take him out, if you will, whether that is an actual assassination or whether that is just simply removing him from power. He will, someone like this, and I'm not saying for better or worse, but someone like Putin, in my view, always has plans at, backup plan on top of backup plans at hand. Ultimately, there comes a point where I think you can only have so many backup plans until it comes down to just trusting your inner circle of your team. But at that point, again, that's, I guess you could say that's the name of the game in intelligence, if you will. So now with that said as well, I also want to mention, and I say this very carefully, it's also quite possible that this is a we could say piece of information used to create distrust. And when I say piece of information, I refer to this article in particular. Now, that does not mean that I am trying to allude to this article being false, but it makes one view something from a slightly different perspective that, again, sometimes, we see it happen on both sides. Countries will put out articles to dissuade or create issues within the higher echelon levels of the countries they're attempting to target. I'm not saying that is the case here, but it's definitely something we need to, I think, focus on and look at, if you will. So that's my 2 cents there.
So, okay, yes, you're absolutely right. And just in real time, I'm reading this article, and this whole thing is being reported by Radio Free Europe. So, saying earlier this week, municipal deputies in Moscow's Lomonosovsky district demanded Putin step down, claiming that his aggressive stance has plunged Russia back into the Cold War era. Reported Radio Free Europe. In my head, I'm thinking of all the covert CIA operations that were established all over the world to spread deliberate propaganda and disinformation. So what is this? Well, Radio Free Europe Liberty is a United States government-funded organization that broadcasts and reports news, information, and analysis. And there we go. So the main source that they're using in this thing is Western disinformation, essentially. So, but what you said, Dave, is perfectly spot on and segues excellent into this one. Russia post-Putin. What happens if the president suddenly dies? Like, just to have this out there, like, honestly, we don't even need to read more of this article because, like you just said, there's all these contingency plans in place in case something happens. But I find it fascinating that they talk about, oh, he needs to step down. And, well, what if he suddenly dies? What are we going to do?
I want to say as well that it's just as likely that, for example, the story like this may run on Biden in China, for example. So I don't claim to lean in either
Correct.
direction. It's just one thing to note that tactics are used against one another constantly, in my humble view. But sorry.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's just to bring it up, and the consistency in these stories. It's like, yeah, this is from Al Jazeera, though, so it's not like a CNN story. But like you said, the CCP's news would say the same thing about Biden and all that. But just find those very connected. And here, for you.
The next thing is that according to the Jerusalem Post, the Russia-Ukraine war, Pope Francis urges for the end of World War. Quote, "Today we are living through a world war. Let us stop, please," end quote, Pope Francis said on Wednesday. I mean, okay, I don't want to immediately dismiss this as well. Okay, we can argue that the same person speaking on behalf of not just the Vatican, but arguably, as some say, God, if you will. And I don't mean that as an insult, but one could say that's quite ironic considering the institution the Pope is associated with and the
That's
role.
why I laughed, and
Right,
I'm
right,
sorry if that
right.
was rude, but yeah.
No, not at all, not at all. I just say that for those that again are trying to view this in various aspects of the world. But ultimately, we see that at least in my humble perspective, and I think Rio would probably agree here, that we look at this and it's kind of like, okay, on one hand, it's we can argue the Vatican is partly the reason. If anyone reads the literature and does their own research, is part of the reason that a lot of these not just technologies but pieces of knowledge have been suppressed. But as well, at the same time, one could say, okay, well, to play devil's advocate, Dave, this was a very corrupt institution established many hundreds of years ago, and so it's hard when you come into the role as a pope or a cardinal or a bishop to suddenly want to just change everything without fearing getting killed. And again, I don't know. It's tough because the more any group or body spirals into a form of corruption, the harder it is to get out of it. So I'm not saying that with respects to the Vatican. I'm just saying that in general, but I would attribute that to an ironic statement, or at least personally interpreted as by me as an ironic statement made by the Pope. But again, that's where I stand personally.
Yeah, I'm just a little caught up by his eyes, to be honest. They just look very dark. And I mean, we could just do an episode on the symbolism of the Pope's attire and all that, but that's not what we're here on the Kraken to do. But just for the audience, just keep in mind of the sacred symbolism and perverted symbolism that these institutions use. Next up, we have from Al Jazeera, Trump lawyers reject Justice Department probe as misguided. The former U.S. president's legal team says court freeze on government review of records seized at Mar-a-Lago should persist. Yeah, this has been an interesting story. I really haven't been keeping up to date. There's been so many updates every single day, and it's like he says this, he says this. I did like the one where his documents were actually about the sex life of Macron, the French president, which I did report on. So the idea that he actually had dirt on other political leaders, and that was the reason for the raid. But of course, there's still the UFO file aspect of things. Did he take stuff? Now they're also talking about that it was nuclear secrets of other countries. But I personally don't subscribe to the whole nuclear threat narrative, so that doesn't really do it for me. I kind of am leaning towards it. Yeah, he probably has secrets on the blackmail, that he's got like some Epstein-esque Maxwell kind of blackmail
See,
going on. What do
this
you
is
think?
where I go to as well. My mind jumps to, I saw an article this morning. I forgot which publication, but it was saying, quote unquote experts say, and I giggle at that, but whatever. Experts say, it seems like the Trump organization is trying to stall this investigation till after the 2022 midterms. And to be honest with you, regardless of my personal political views, I I I couldn't agree more because again, both sides are playing chess here. They will use as many avenues to their advantage as possible. That doesn't make them good nor bad. But again, I see that line or way of thinking, if you will, seems to be absent and potentially, arguably, deliberately absent from the establishment media, almost as if they want to invigorate a far more emotional response. So at the end of the day, look, is the Trump administration, stalling, or the Trump organization? Possibly. I don't consider that bad nor good. It's just, again, it is a movement, it is a resource, it is a tool that is being used against, again, in this case, certain elements of whether the Democratic Party, you name it. We see, for example, if we reverse to before Trump came into the picture, we see Dick Cheney and his daughter Liz Cheney on CNN in 2014 or 15 talking about, trashing Obama, saying, Obama was the worst, he's done the worst damage ever. And what I'm trying to say is I don't agree or disagree with that. What I'm trying to say is the tactics are always used. It's just that seemingly the basic normal attacks that they would use before Trump came into the picture didn't seem to work on Trump this time around. Now, I'm not trying to say that in a supportive or unsupportive manner, but it seemed like it took a little more to try and get at him. And it still seemed, I mean, for example, a lot of people have said, have you seen since the Mar-a-Lago raid, the Trump, the donations for his upcoming campaign have only increased. So again, I
It's
see it
like
as,
when you try to silence somebody, they only get more popular.
Well, this is like something I think Jordan Peterson said on Joe Rogan 3-4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago at this point, actually, where he said, he goes, well, and this was actually before there was still the buildup, but before the, all of the, you could say, the political divisiveness at this climate now. But Peterson would say, the more controversial interviews I conducted with respects to, questioning and things like this, the more my Patreon grew. So, what does that tell you? That's where I stand.
Absolutely. Yeah, the next one. Is this you or me? Okay, so Syrian doctor gathering intel for the Mossad captured in Lebanon. This is from the Jerusalem Post. And just for the Jerusalem Post is having some very juicy stories over the past little while. It's actually one of my favorite sources of open source information. I find it to be a much broader range of understanding the geopolitics of world orders, because they're, to be getting news actually about the Mossad. It's really one of the only sources you can go to for that. But so the story says, the doctor was posing as an employee of a fictitious company that claims to purify Syria's waters. The doctor reportedly gathered intelligence significant to Israel's security. And really, again, we don't even need to go more into it. We can dissect that story, but like they ask, how did the Syrian doctor begin allegedly working for Mossad? But really, what I just wanted to point out is the fake company that the doctor was allegedly working for. That stuff that we've talked about so much on the Patreon and even the public episodes. But what they say is that the project manager offered to bankroll a cement factory owned by the doctor's father and began to communicate with his family in the hopes of recruiting them. So it goes to show you that, it's not a conspiracy about how all of these things work, that organized crime, governments, intelligence agencies, corporations, they're all working with each other. I've done some deep dives on Dose of Reality on the Patreon about certain local politicians and their financial dealings and all that. But yeah, Dave, do you have anything to share with this one?
This is tit for tat chess game intelligence. I'll just leave it there. That's
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So the next thing is that, according to Al Jazeera, suspects to face trial in October for Cypriot passport scandal. The defendants, including former president of the Cypriot parliament, forgive me if I butchered that, were exposed by Al Jazeera's investigative unit. The former president of the Cypriot parliament, Dimitris Siloris, and 3 others will face a criminal trial next month over a cash for passport scandal exposed by Al Jazeera's investigative unit, a court has ruled.
Again, so the country of Cyprus, just so people know, that's just what you call somebody from Cyprus.
Perfect. Thank you. Again, I will say it's humans being humans, and I don't mean to use that as a dismissal of any of this, but rather, I mean, this is, you can call it a quid pro quo, you can call it trying to make money on the side. This has always been a thing. It's just, in my humble opinion, this time they got caught. So that's where I stand. I could be wrong, but
absolutely. And it also does feel like whole thing of rules for thee, not for me. So, of course, if you have the money, you're the elites. No, you don't need to be locked down. No, you don't need to do any of that. You just, if you got the money, yeah, you can do whatever you want. That's pretty much what it is. The U.S. military plans to open testing facility in Saudi Arabia. From the Jerusalem Post. Back in July of this year, during President Joe Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia, the 2 countries agreed on the importance of stopping Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. So this story, the facility is currently being referred to as the Red Sands Integrated Experimentation Center, and it is an innovative approach to training and readiness between our Middle East partners and the United States. So this one with the United States and Saudi Arabia working together more, especially after, this is from September 10th, maybe a bit insensitive to the 9/11 people that died. Can I
take it one step further? Is that
please?
Is that Prince Al Walid there in the picture, if I'm not mistaken? Or am I
I see. I unfortunately don't know the names.
Mohammed bin Salman, excuse me. Mohammed bin Salman. There we go. Not Al Walid. What am I saying? Mohammed bin Salman, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong, but I don't think so, was very close with Epstein. And we
Yes.
know, for example, that Epstein allegedly was a Mossad agent. It's almost like perhaps one route amongst many others is Epstein was gathering dirt on, say, perhaps Mohammed, maybe for, say, Israel or the Mossad to then ensure the United States does what other interests may want. I don't know, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah. And then who knows how
Again,
much of,
I could be very wrong, but yeah.
yeah. And it's a military testing facility that they're just the most vague name of Red Sands Integrated Experimentation Center. Like, I, okay, yeah, there's so much to unpack with this one, but just the timing of 9/11 with what you brought up with the Epstein ties, to me, it's just like this, they could have just been a little more mindful of declaring that they have this new agreement without getting too deep into the 9/11 conspiracy stuff. But we're going to skip that one because that's annoying. So this one's for you.
According to RT.com, hundreds of secret NATO documents leaked. The data is reportedly for sale on the dark web after Portugal's general staff was hacked. Again, I'm going to leave this there because the outlet source, and I quote, claims that it was the U.S. and intel community that found hundreds of confidential or secret NATO documents put up for, sale on the dark web. According to the report, the notice on the discovery was sent directly to Antonio Costa, the nation's prime minister, last August. A spokesperson for the U.S. Embassy in Lisbon would neither confirm nor deny, saying they do not comment on intelligence matters, end quote. Again, we're seeing the intelligence operations being far more, I guess you could say, exposed or coming to light, if you will. Now, one could argue very strongly, this is reported by RT. They're always going to try and take a jab at the West. With that said, granted, we also have to keep in mind that arguably the outlets in the West would never report on this either. So it's kind of trying to use your own discernment to find that middle ground. That's where I go in this regard.
Absolutely. And we do have to always keep in mind that it is RT News. So even if you post an article on Facebook from RT News in Canada, they will say, are you sure you want to say that, post this? Because our experts say that this is sponsored by the Russian government. But this is an interesting just side note, brand new article that just came out. The European Union aid money drying up due to Ukraine, says Bill Gates. We're not going to get into that. That was just one of the top stories on RT News. But I think, yeah, we're going to go to this one, and then we're going to conclude with, we've got about 4 more, and then we're going to be wrapping up. But here we have local elected official arrested in the U.S. journalist killing. The murdered Las Vegas journalist had reported extensively on allegations against the county public administrator. Police have arrested a local county official for the murder of Las Vegas Review-Journal investigative reporter Jeff German. Robert Tellis, a 45-year-old public administrator of Clark County in the U.S. state of Nevada, which includes the city of Las Vegas, was taken into custody on Wednesday after police searched his home. So turns out that his fingerprints were found, and he is being associated with the killing of a journalist that was digging up dirt on the politician. So the theme of today's Kraken is kind of like, there's very like the minute details of the corruption that's going on and things coming to light of how of people like really getting caught. It's almost as if this has been going on for decades and decades and decades. Passports, killing people.
If
But
you scroll down a little more, Riel, to your point, I want to say, let's see here, right there. German 69 had reported extensively, and I quote, on allegations relating to administrative bullying, favoritism, and Telly's relationship with a subordinate in the office, which handles the property of people who die without a will or family contacts. The reporting preceded Telly's loss in the Democratic primary in June, which ended his re-election bid, end quote. Again, to your point.
Yeah, absolutely. And just that's, yeah. Obviously very sad, and people shouldn't be punished for being journalists for doing the reporting. And that's honestly what we're doing with reporting the news. We're kind of auditing what's going on in the world. And it is just a very sad and unfortunate state to see that people that are trying to report on the truth are not only being censored, but actually becoming expired from the people that don't want to be found out. So this one's for you here.
The next thing is that according to Korean Time or koreatimes.co.kr, young farmers see opportunities in smart farming. We see here, and I quote, Farming used to be about working endless hours in the sun, defined by repetitive, time-consuming labor that goes on for days or months. It was rarely associated with creating high or added value, the key criteria for determining an industry's contribution to the advancement of the economy. We see here that, again, and I quote, "At the touch of a button, practically everything is manageable," said Shinna Ra, a 23-year-old farmer who owns a smart strawberry farm in Sangju, North. Sorry, if you could scroll up a little more. Perfect. North Gyeongsang province, end quote. So again, it's interesting to see the younger generation say enough with this with this suppression and covering up of things for the sake of just profiting at the top. If we can help everyone, then by definition we help ourselves grow too. So that's where I stand on this.
Sure. And my mind actually, I included this because I went in a little bit of a different direction with smart farming. Like the agriculture sector is now being taken over, which we know it's been for a very long time, by the biosurveillance state and the United Nations Agenda 2030, all of those things, smart cities, smart farming now. So this may be for the greater good. This may be that they're actually producing better crops and better fruit, but it does concern me a little bit that they're calling it smart farming. You shouldn't be having dumb farming, but yeah, we're not going to have the time to go too deep into this one, the September 11th, what went wrong. I'm going to reserve that for another Kraken just because I want to actually go deeper into that. But here we're going to end on a few two COVID articles, just kept them for last because, you know, we wanted to get all the fun stuff out of the way. But first we have scientists find the CV-19 antibodies that can make boosters unnecessary from the Jerusalem Post. Researchers at Tel Aviv University found 2 antibodies that neutralize all known strains of CV-19 with up to 95% efficiency. Like, okay. And it's like when Sanjay Gupta asked Anthony Fauci about the studies out of Israel and that talked about myocarditis in kids and the efficiency of things. And
Fauci said he had no comment. He didn't.
He's like, we'll look into that. You know what? That's a good point. We'll have to look into it. And it's like they just completely ignore things that are coming out of the world leader in the vaccination campaign of Israel. Like these guys were the first countries to get everybody taking the shot, and now they're actually coming up with science to talk about how it's going, and we're completely ignoring it. So just wanted to bring this one up because this is something that anybody can share to anybody that's, you know, pro lockdowns, pro mandates, and it's like, well, actually the latest things say otherwise.
I stand with respects to the whole, to each individual's own decision personally, but again, I highly encourage to think for yourselves, research for yourselves, and yes, yeah, that's where I stand.
Yeah. And this is our last one for the day, and it's a bit somber, but it's
sure
just the way it is.
You want me to take it, or
you got it?
Sure. So according to ctvnews.ca, again, Canadian outlet, long COVID's linked to suicide. Scientists warn of hidden crisis. We see here that
before you go, the graph says 96. What was the age that she passed away on? She was 96 years old, and she passed. So that's just, I find that interesting.
That's
Sorry,
interesting.
Continue.
We see here that okay, Scott Taylor never got to move on from COVID-19. The 56-year-old, and I quote, who caught the disease in spring 2020, has still not recovered. About 18 months later, when he had killed himself at his home near Dallas, having lost his health, memory, and money.
And to be honest, like this is more of like an opinion piece by Reuters, but I just really wanted to include it because now they are straight up linking.
It stands right. It stands to say, again, is there some validity that is not, again, and to be very neutral, if you will, that is not to say that I guess you could say the lockdowns were quote unquote bad immediately off the bat. Now, if I could go back personally, I would maybe lock down for max couple weeks, if even that, and even then I would again, that's still within the context of the system that we're within. If we're talking outside a newly revamped system, dare I say, this could have been squashed without any type of lockdown, without any type of exploitation of any economic scenarios, you name it. Now, again, it speaks to this idea of, for example, certain doctors that signed the Great Barrington Declaration, saying, for example, if I'm not mistaken, the lockdowns were going to do far more damage than the isolation and the virus itself, if you will. You know, I gotta say, I think back to Trump when he said the cure cannot be worse than the problem itself. We looking back, it speaks to this whole concept of the time old, oh well, it won't happen again. As I say, if personally for me, I'm of the humble perspective. For those that want my take, I never would have done a lockdown myself. But again, within the context and the confines of the situation given 2 years ago, I would have done at most a couple weeks, if that, in terms of, just to see what would happen if there was an isolationist component. But even then, I would still have ruffled with that quite heavily, because I don't think any entity should tell an individual, in my personal opinion, when one can or cannot leave the home. And we saw that arguably taken out of hand quite extensively. So that's where I personally stand.
Right on. Yeah. And for me, it just goes back, like, goes down to the whole narrative of the lab leak theory. And going, for me, we would be going back to all of the actual sources of information that we are being told that has been kind of categorically shown to be at the best misleading, at worst an outright lie. So but yeah, that was all that we I wanted to keep it a little bit more brief. But there we have it for our Unleashing the Kraken today on September 13th, 2022. Thank you so much, Dave, for being here with me today. We know the audience loves your, you're the OG GZ. So
I appreciate it so much. And as I said at the beginning of this recording as well, stay tuned for what will be coming, not just to the show, but potentially to other things as well in the coming weeks. And thank you so much to Riel and to the audience, whether you watched visually or tuned in from an audio perspective. Thank you so much.